Well, today we're going to continue our series, understanding the emotions of God. There's a lot of good things, and I think after just Cheryl's announcement, we could go home because we're living on mission as a church, and she's right. Hope Community Church was being externally focused before we got external focused, because externally focused is just simply our modern language or whatever to talk about doing what it is that Jesus tells us to do, and that is to go make disciples. These are Jesus's words, right? Go into the world and make disciples, baptizing, teaching them to obey everything which I've commanded you in Matthew 28. And being internally strong and externally focused is us doing that. Going into the world and making disciples, that's being externally focused. Making disciples, that's being internally strong. Teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you, that's about us being internally strong. And so we already had the sermon, and we've been reminded that we've been living that way as a church. But today we're going to continue our series, Understanding the Emotions of God. And today we're going to be talking about how you and I, we can please God. And how God has an emotion of pleasure and being pleased and being satisfied and having good feelings towards us and to look good upon us. He can have these emotions of pleasure. We're going to see that this morning. To get us started, I just want to tell you a little story. Yesterday, Valerie and I had the privilege of hanging out with 40 to 50 of us from Hope Community Church, somewhere between 10 and 15 families, camping some 35 minutes away from us. It wasn't very far away, but man, when I got there, I felt like, wow, I'm just so far away from life here in Lancaster County, and I think we didn't even we got out of Lancaster County, just a little bit out of Lancaster County, but not too far away. And yesterday, Valerie and I had the privilege of spending a lot of time with our granddaughter. So our son and his wife were along camping, but Valerie and I, we just to bless our son and daughter-in-law, we took little Kendall for a walk on this long mountain trail. We were gone for an hour and a half walking through the woods. And one of the things that you see about Kendall in these pictures is just a smile on her face. This little girl smiles constantly. And she brings such pleasure to us as her grandparents. I know she brings great pleasure to her parents. But what's interesting about us as people is, we know as adults, we know what it is to feel pleasure, right? And when you watch kids learn at a very young age what pleasure is and how to bring pleasure to other people. Hang with me for a second on this. Little kids do things over and over again, probably when they get a little bit older than Kendall. Probably when they get around, maybe 1.5, 2, 3, 4, 5, definitely into those ages. You can watch little kids, and they do things on purpose to bring a smile to those of us who are adults. They just intuitively, instinctively do this, right? And they want to see you smile, and when you smile, what do? They do whatever it was that they were doing over again. Why? To see you smile, right? And this is what kids do. Kids do this repeatedly, over and over and over. I can think of a time when we as a family were at Camp Sunshine. It was a camp for families who have kids who have cancer. And so at the time, our son Luke was in recovery, in remission from his cancer. And so as a family, we were blessed with this opportunity to go to Camp Sunshine. And one of the things at Camp Sunshine they did was they did things for kids and they did things for adults. And then Friday evening was this big kind of celebration party kind of a thing. And then the kids came on stage and they did their little talents. And we had one of our kids get on the stage, and his talent was to be able to do a cartwheel. He was just a young little guy. So he did this cartwheel, and the audience applauded. And so after he got back onto his feet, he kind of pulled his little shirt down, and he stood there, and everybody's applauding. So he didn't know what to do, but he knew he was bringing pleasure to all the adults in the auditorium, so he did another cartwheel, to which the crowd just busted into just this huge applause. So then, of course, he stood back up, pulled his shirt down, and did another one. And again, rousing applause. And so he did another one. And I think he did probably 5 cartwheels to just this great thunderous applause to all the adults. Now, why did he do that? Well, yeah, sure, the nervousness, he doesn't know what to do. But he knew what he was doing was bringing pleasure to all of the people around. And what was it doing to him? It was also bringing him pleasure. See, this is the interesting thing about us as people. We learn early on that if we bring pleasure to other people, that brings us pleasure. And so we do it again to bring pleasure to other people. Now, when we understand that, as a young kid, somewhere along the line, we lose that. And what takes over in us as human beings is the flesh and the sin nature. And what happens in the flesh and the sin nature is we want to please ourselves. And suddenly what happens is we do things to satisfy ourselves, to please ourselves. And we don't do things to please and satisfy other people. We've learned as a child that the feeling of pleasure is a good feeling, and now we do everything to satisfy ourselves. And we've gone from, as a little kid, learning how to do something for somebody else to bring them pleasure, to being somebody who lives in the flesh, lives according to the sin nature, and does it for themselves. That's sin, and that's what sin does. Sin creates all kinds of problems in the world around us. Now, as people, why we, like as you see this in little kids, why we do this is because we want to receive affirmation and acceptance and attention and inclusion. It's a relational thing. Okay? So as little kids, we attempt to please people, we attempt to please our parents, we attempt to please adults so that we get welcomed and included into their life. This is a huge, huge thing as people. There's research that's been done, scientific research, social research, to try and understand the human condition. And back in the early 1940s, there was a study conducted by Harvard University. It was a 70-long-year research project. So that takes us into just 5 years ago that this study kind of culminated and completed, and actually they're still continuing it. But Harvard started this research in which they studied 268 adult males to find out the keys to success in life. One of those students was John F. Kennedy, former president. 2015, after just studying for 70 plus years, these adult men, these 268 men, the conclusion was released in a book. And here's just a brief 2 or 3 sentence summary of the conclusion of this study. The conclusion is this: happy and successful lives are rooted in good relationships with parents. A feeling of acceptance, nurture, and parental love during childhood is one of the best predictors of future success, happiness, and life satisfaction for adults. Kids who grow up in meaningful relationships with their parents, where their parents respond to them when they do their cartwheels, when they say, "Can I help carry out the trash? Can I help make the bed? Can I help clean the toilet?" When they're right there with you, kids being right there with you, wanting to be in the mix, and a parent responds in love and support and care. That kind of environment is what produces healthy kids. Now, why is that? Why is that? It's because that's how we have been made as people. See, as people, we said this each week in this series, as people, we are made in the image of God. We believe at Hope Community Church that there is a God and that God created. We do not believe in evolution, that somehow we as people came out of the ground out of nothingness. No, we believe that as people, we came out of the ground as nothingness and God breathed. God is the one that took the dirt and breathed into people's life. So we've been made in God's image, and what that means is we've been made like God, and God is relational. And so in the Bible, we see that God is one. There's only one God. And yet in Scripture, we see this concept that we cannot as human beings understand, which is great because that would make us like God. But we can't understand. What we see in Scripture is that God exists. It's one God in three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. We call that the Trinity. That word is not in the Bible. It's just a man-made word to try and describe what's going on. But we see in Scripture that there's one God existing in three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. And what else we see in Scripture is that God is love and that God is perfect and that God exists in this relationship amongst himself in which he loves himself, cares for himself is what we talked about last week. And this week, pleasure. He finds pleasure in himself. He brings happiness to himself. The Father is well pleased with the Son. We see in Matthew chapter 3, there's this voice that comes from heaven after Jesus' baptism. And this voice, next slide please. The voice says, "This is my Son. I love him." This is what love does, right? Love attempts to please. I love him, and with him I'm well pleased. In Jesus' teaching, we find him saying to the crowds, "Hey, the one who sent me, the Father, he's with me. I love him. He's not left me alone. And everything I do is for his pleasure. I live my life to please my Father." This is who Jesus is. So the Godhead, in the Godhead, Father, Son, and the Spirit, they exist in relationship, in love, caring for each other, showing concern to each other, and finding pleasure in each other. And because of that, you and I have been made in his image, in his likeness, and we are made relational to do the same things. And that's why these smart people at Harvard can study people and go, "Oh, look at that. As people, we desire to be in relationships, and the most healthy people are those that are in relationships that are meaningful relationships in which people experience love, care, concern." And we learn that we can bring pleasure as we are in that relationship serving our parents. This is what it means for us as human beings to live healthy lives. Now, what we're going to see this morning is that God has this emotion of pleasure. God is pleased. He can be pleased with you and not pleased with you. Actually, we saw that in the first week of the series, right? That we can grieve God's heart. We can bring great displeasure to his heart. And he can be so full of hurt and pain. That's what we saw in Genesis chapter 6, right? We can bring displeasure to God. Today, we can bring pleasure to God. We can please God. And the story we're looking at, because this series comes out of the Old Testament, comes out of Old Testament stories, and stories are beautiful. There's not a lot of instruction, but there's so many nuances and principles through the stories that we can learn about God and we can learn about people. And today, from the life of King Solomon, 1 Kings chapter 3, I invite you to turn in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 3, where we're going to see that Solomon pleases God. There's a lot here, as in all of these stories that we've read. I'm going to read it, follow along. Hopefully you can hang in there for the several minutes it's going to take to read through this, and imagine in your mind's eye being present in this story. So Solomon, who's the son of King David, his father has died, and now Solomon is the king. So Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David, which is the city of Jerusalem, until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. You can go to Jerusalem today, and you will see the remnants of these. They are still there. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. And Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense in the high places. I'm going to just pause for a second and just highlight a few things here. These high places, God gave direct instruction to the nation of Israel. When you leave Egypt and you enter the promised land, when you go there, destroy the high places. Do not worship at the high places. The high places are the places which all the other nations would go to worship gods. It kind of makes sense. You go to the highest place on the planet in your territory, right? So that you can get as close as you can to God. Kind of makes sense, right? And there, you would offer sacrifices to the gods. So that sometimes it would be food, sometimes it would be people. And also there would be sex that would take place. And this is to symbolize before the gods this to seek this bearing of fruit, this production of further life. And so these high places, you can find they're all over. Archaeology, they're cool. You can see images of them. You can go to these places all throughout the Middle East. And God gave this instruction to destroy them. And so here in this text, we see that there's still some high places. Now, what we're not absolutely certain, and scholars debate on, is the nation of Israel at this place right now, in this time, behaving against what God says, or is this instead a statement to say that they're worshiping at this high place, or this place called Shiloh, or in Gibeon, because that's where the tabernacle was? And so let's read the next verse, and we'll get into that a little bit. So the king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices. So this is King Solomon, to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Now, if that's all you're reading is 1 Kings, then you miss 2 Chronicles. And so 2 Chronicles tells the same story. You can read this on your own this week as well and kind of look at the parallels. But in 2 Chronicles, this is what we read. And Solomon, the king, and the whole assembly went to the high place at Gibeon, same as in 1 Kings, right? For God's tent of meeting was there. Oh, that's interesting. God's tent of meeting is at Gibeon. So Solomon goes to Gibeon to the tent of meeting. Well, what's this tent of meeting? Well, the tent of meeting, which is what Moses, the Lord's servant, had made in the desert. Now, David had brought up the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim to the place he had prepared for it, because he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. And Solomon went up to the bronze altar before the Lord in the tent of meeting and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. Now, so what's happening here is many scholars think that actually what's going on is that this isn't like something to say against Solomon's character, that somehow he was not following God full-heartedly by worshiping at the high places, but instead to say that at the high place, Gibeon, is where the tabernacle is. The tabernacle was the tent that God said, build this tent, put it in the center of the community. Everybody set up their houses according to the 12 tribes. They lived, we live in neighborhoods. In the center of the community is the tabernacle. All 12 tribes set up like in a circle around the tabernacle, and their front door, the front of their tent, opened when they stepped out. Every morning they looked at the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was the place that God met with his people. There was a visible presence, cloud over it. All kinds of crazy, amazing supernatural things happened, but it was a visible presence in the nation for them to remember. This is the tabernacle that they built. You can read about it in Exodus 20 on, and they carried it with them. This is the same tabernacle now 500, maybe 50 years into the future from when they built it out in the wilderness, and the tabernacle is set up in Gibeon. The tabernacle is where the people would go to meet with God, and God would meet with them. And so it's probably what's happening in 1 Kings 3. What the writer is saying is that the temple had not yet been built in Jerusalem, so the tabernacle, the tent that they would carry around to be the place where they would worship God, was in Gibeon. And the temple had not yet been fully built, which Solomon is going to do in his lifetime. All right, so now moving on. At Gibeon, the Lord appealed to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, ask for whatever you want to give you. Or ask for whatever you want me to give to you. What an amazing thing. God appears to you and says, what do you want? I'm going to give you anything that you ask for. And Solomon answered, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son, which is me, to sit on his throne, which is amazing that I get to sit on my father's throne. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king. You've made me the king in place of my father David, but I'm only a little child. and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen. These are your people. And there's a great number of them. There's too many, too numerous for me to count. So, this is my request. Would you give me, your servant, a discerning heart? Give me wisdom to govern your people and to distinguish between what is right and wrong, to have an insight into the heart, to be able to discern between the truth and falsehood and what is sinful and what is not. What a request. God, I want to know the heart. I want to know how to discern between what is good and right and wrong. Why? For who is able to govern this great people of yours? Yeah, I can't do it with what limited knowledge I have. So verse 10 tells us that the Lord was pleased. The Lord found pleasure in Solomon's request. And God said to him, since you've asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did, I will also give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke. He realized he had a dream. He returned to Jerusalem. He stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. And then he gave a feast for all his court. The Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be in the tabernacle. David brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant was definitely this place where the Ten Commandments were in. There was cherub, and this was the place that the high priest would go to meet with God, was in front of the Ark of the Covenant. David had brought the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant in that next week, and David bringing it to the city. But David had brought it back and had pitched a tent just for the Ark of the Covenant, and at Gibeon is the tabernacle. So the two are in separate places. Solomon goes to both of these places. He offers these great sacrifices. So what we see from this story is that it's possible for us to please God, right? We can please God. Now, there's three things, there's three actions, there's three heart attitudes that we see in Solomon that leads him to make the request that he makes. And these three actions probably are really important actions for us as we think about what's going on inside of our hearts if we want to please God. And those three things, the first one we see right in the beginning of verse 3. We see that Solomon loves God most, right? Solomon seeks to please God above anything else. His desire is to please God, not please himself. That's his utmost desire. So we see right in verse 3 that Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David. He demonstrates this pleasure seeking of God by what it is that he chooses to do. Right? His love is for God. We see in verse 4 that he went to Gibeon and he demonstrates that love by offering 1,000 burnt offerings. Well, that's a lot, right? And then what we then see is that this idea of pleasing God, that Hebrew word to please, yatav, is to be good, to be well, to be glad, to be pleasing. It's for God to see and to look upon us as good. Solomon pleases God because he loves God. You see, it's pretty significant and important for us to remember that our actions always follow our affections, right? If you can just remember this in life, your actions, how you're living your life, is always following your affections. It's following what it is that you're loving in life. What it is that you are seeking to bring pleasure, or how you're seeking to bring satisfaction, is what it is that you're going to end up doing. Our affections always lead to our actions. And what we see in Solomon is that his affections, his love, is for God primarily. So you see this in little kids, right? You do see little kids genuinely desiring to please their parents. It's in their heart to make their parents happy, genuinely for the sake of their parents. And so they'll make their bed, or they'll help make dinner, or they will take out the trash out of the motivation of making their parents happy. They're doing it for their parents' pleasure. They're doing it to serve their parents. They're doing it out of love for their parents. You see this in adults, right? Adults in loving dating relationships, adults in loving marriage relationships, where somebody will change the oil on the car in their mind with the direct intent to bless the spouse. Somebody will make a meal, will do the laundry, take out the trash in their mind because they are seeking to serve and bring pleasure and satisfaction to their spouse. Actions always follow our affections. And what we see in Solomon is that he brings pleasure to God because his affections are for God primarily. Where are your affections? The second thing that we see in the life of Solomon is not only that he seeks to please God, but he is thankful to God for what God has done for him. Right? He understands that God is a kind God. God is showing kindness to him, the most unlikely of all of David's sons. Solomon should not be alive if David was a righteous man. But in an act of sin, and in multiple acts of sin, David took Bathsheba to be his wife. Sin brings displeasure to God. David acted in great displeasure to God when he sinned against Bathsheba and sinned against Bathsheba's husband, and took Bathsheba to be his wife and had Bathsheba's husband, who was a loyal servant of his, killed. The result of this marriage is that God doesn't stay angry at David in his sin because David repents of his sin, but God blesses David and Bathsheba and gives them a son, Solomon, and Solomon becomes the king. What a crazy story. That even in our sin, when we repent of it, God can still and does still choose to use us. And so here the most unlikely of David's sons is named king. And he recognizes this and he gives thanks to God. He gives thanks to God for his kindness that he showed to his father David, but also to himself. Solomon is seeking to please God above all else. Solomon brings pleasure to God by having a thankful heart. And then third, Solomon brings pleasure to God by demonstrating a humble heart. Right? And what do we see in verse 7 when God says, hey, I'm God, I'm going to do whatever it is that you asked of me? What is it that he says? He says, I'm only a little child, and I don't know how to carry out my duties. I'm just a little kid. I have no idea how to lead this nation. Now, how does a person come to a place to be able to say that? I mean, Solomon's son who takes over for him when he dies, his son Rehoboam, has the exact opposite attitude. Rehoboam has a heart of pride and arrogance and says, I don't need God, and I don't even need my father's advisors. Instead, I am going to do what I want to do. I have enough wisdom. And he ends up splitting the kingdom over it. Solomon has a humble heart. Solomon has a heart that recognizes that he doesn't know how to lead. He doesn't know how to make all the right decisions. He recognizes that he's just a young man. He needs assistance. He needs help. He needs God. He needs something supernatural in order for him to be able to be successful at what it is. Where am I at in life? Do I have a humble heart, Or am I self-confident in my abilities to complete my education? Self-confident in my abilities to advance in my career? Self-confident in being able to be successful at what it is that I'm doing as a parent? Do I have a humble heart? Or do I have a confident heart that's just confident in my abilities? If that's me, then I'm not able to, and I can't, and I won't bring pleasure to God. Again, the three characteristics that we see in this text is that Solomon seeks to please God as his primary person that he's seeking to please. Secondly, Solomon has a thankful heart. And finally, Solomon is humble. James, I invite you to come back up and close us in worship. But as we do that, I'm just going to ask you, where are you in terms of your thoughts about yourself and who it is that you are seeking to please? Are you seeking to please yourself, or are you seeking to please God? Romans 12 tells us this: therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. I offer my body as a living sacrifice. In other words, how I'm going to live my life is not for myself. The flesh says, do everything to please self. Little kids eventually grow to a place in which they learn that the pleasure that they get in life is something that they're after, and they live according to the flesh. And they're not willing to live their life as a living sacrifice. Paul tells us to live our lives as living sacrifices, which is holy and pleasing to God. Am I living to please myself, or am I living to please God?